We have a lot of people online actually at the moment. We have nearly 60 participants, which is a terrific show. So yes, welcome and thanks for your forbearance during the few minutes that we've had fun dealing with Zoom. I think we've all had fun dealing with Zoom the last 2 months or so. I would like to just explain a little bit about why we're here. We're here because Which School Advisor and Schools Compared, we came up with an idea. We come up with ideas a lot of the time. We go to schools and we talk to them, and some of the times the schools look at us in that funny way and say, yeah, guys, take your idea and come back and talk to us some other time. This particular occasion, we came up with this idea, and the idea was to write a novel. But it wasn't just one person writing the novel. We decided we would do it via relay. And it was actually inspired. It was a Portuguese author who's been doing this during lockdown, a very noted Portuguese novelist. And because she couldn't write, and a lot of the novelists in Portugal couldn't write themselves, they decided, right, okay, we're only going to go a chapter at a time. So when I saw the idea, it was a couple of months ago, I thought, well, why don't we try this with the schools? So we pitched it to the schools, and the schools said, yes, this is a fabulous idea. We love it. And we've had a phenomenal response to it. We've been completely overwhelmed by it. So we have 24 schools. We actually had to put a limit on this particular occasion. We've had 24 schools have volunteered their services here, and we have around about 80 participants. So over the course of 80, well, a little longer than 80 days, you're going to see this relay of chapters happening, and they will be published on Schools Compared and Which School Advisor. So we've had, as I say, phenomenal response from the schools, but the potential authors, who are all from year 9 up, are incredibly excited. So I can almost feel, that energy, that excitement coming through to all of us at the moment. And the great news was, we thought, well, these guys need some help. These are first time novelists. So we said, right, what we need is we need to bring in the big guns on this. We need to bring in the guys who can really help them, which is why we have 3 fabulous authors with us today, 3 of whom are very well known to me. It feels like the sort of virtual Emirates Litfest green room here, guys. So I'm delighted to welcome the 3 of you here today. So I'll do some introductions here. We have Annabel Cantaria, who won the Emirates Airline Festival of Literature Monte Grappa Writing Prize in 2013. Since then, she's gone on to be a full-time author with 4 published novels. She writes in the genre that's been dubbed domestic noir, domestic thrillers, family sagas with a dark edge, stories that keep you on the edge of your seat and make you think, what if that happened to me? According to Annabel, I'm very plot-driven, I read widely, and always keep an eye open for real-life stories that capture my imagination. We have New Zealander Brandy Scott, who is very familiar to all who listen to Dubai Eye. She's been the voice of the Business Breakfast since 2006. In 2013, Brandy returned to her native New Zealand, and she went to study how to write a book. She went and she did that, and her first novel, Not Bad People, was published in February 2019 to great acclaim. And since then, it has been picked up by a renowned TV producer, John Barnett, and is going to be made into an 8-part television series. And so Brandy will be talking from her perspective in the last 2 or 3 years. We have Rachel Hamilton waving at us. Rachel is actually in the UK. Rachel used to be based in Dubai, and she, after graduating from Cambridge University, she worked in an ad agency. She worked in a secondary school, a building site, and a men's prison. I've never talked to you about that, actually, Rachel. You need to find out a bit more about that. And her debut novel, The Case of the Exploding Loo, was the runner-up in the 2013 Emirates Festival of Literature First Fiction Competition. And shortly afterwards, she was offered a 2-book deal by Simon & Schuster. The Case of the Exploding Loo, follow-up, went on to be nominated for the Redbridge Children's Book Awards. She is also the author of the Unicorn in New York series, and she says her interests are books, films, stand-up comedy, and cake. and she loves to make people laugh, especially when it's intentional rather than accidental. So welcome to my fabulous panel. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So
with our bookshelves behind us.
I was going to comment on that, yes, because we had this ongoing competition for bookshelves. I'll be checking all of this later on. We might have to award a prize, actually, guys. So what I'd like to start with is really, I mean, we're here to talk about advice and to help the guys do the best they can. And you guys have been through this. You've been the other side of the screen, and you've went and you've studied and you've looked at all of the advice that's there, and you've had people throughout the publishing industry offer you advice as well. And what I would just like to ask you to begin with is, of all of the advice that you have absorbed, of all of the advice that you have been given, what is the best advice that you think you have received, and why? And I'll start with you, Rachel.
I was having to think about this the other day, because people often ask for tips. And I think the best piece of advice I've had is to think about the texture of a book, because I tend to write too much dialogue and things seem to move too fast. And I've been moving from kind of children's writing to adult writing. And somebody said to me, think of the dialogue like an accelerator in a car, and the description as being like the brakes of a car. And it really kind of struck a chord, and it has helped, and it's helped me slow down and just think about it as a kind of pattern with a texture throughout. So that would be the most useful advice I've had, I think.
Brilliant, excellent. What about you, Annabelle? What struck you?
I think one of the most useful tips is to think about how you want your readers to feel when they're reading your story, whether you want them to be excited or feeling scared or happy or satisfied or worried, because once you understand what you want them to feel, it makes it a lot easier to know what you're going to write to make them feel like that.
Excellent. And you, Brandy?
I'm just writing down everybody else's advice.
Yeah, I noticed that.
The best advice I've probably got was to make sure that something is really at stake, which is really easy to forget. But you have to make sure that there is risk involved. Something could go wrong, people could lose something, people could not get something that they want or they need. There has to be a reason for your characters to care and for your reader to care. And it makes the writing so much easier if you fill it full of stakes.
Excellent. And in terms of getting started, because I mean, all of the guys here, it's a sort of a novel experience for them in the sense that they're not actually completing the entire work. So they're actually doing a chapter. So they're going to have to see what went before. They've got to think about what they've got to do themselves, and then they're passing that relay baton on. I mean, I know it's not something that you guys have done, but as they're approaching this, what do you think they should really bear in mind when they are beginning their chapter? Ooh. Annabelle?
I would say make sure that each chapter that you're writing has its own story arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and actually progresses the action along. That it's not just a chapter of description and slow moving stuff, that the actual story will have to progress during the section that you write. Progress whatever direction you want it to go, but make some movement.
Yeah. Brandy?
I've just spotted some writing advice that I once gave Annabelle in a frame in her bookshelf, which is maybe...
Is that right?
I put it there deliberately, Brandy.
Funny enough, I've been told the same thing as Annabelle before, which is to make not just each chapter, but each scene a mini story within that scene, so you can take it away and you feel like something has happened, which is huge. But I would also look at where you start and where you stop. So if you start with something that media res, as they call it in Latin, which I've never learned to speak, and you finish on something that doesn't have to be a cliffhanger, but does make people think, ooh, I wonder where this is going. I wonder what's going to happen. Then it makes everything a lot grabbier. It makes it feel more vital.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about, when Charles Dickens was writing his novels. I mean, he used to write them in weekly sequence. So to a degree, it was a bit similar to this. I mean, I'm not comparing everybody here, to Charles Dickens, but I'm thinking that if that he had to think similarly, didn't he? He was finishing this week's chapter, and he had to pull him back for next week. So that really is something that these guys need to think about. And I was struck also by the the mention of description, because is it often difficult to get stuck into description, and you end up, because I mean the guys have been given a word count here. They've been given up to 1,000 words. If they may love getting into a beautiful description, but then that will lose the story. Is that a possibility then, Rachel?
I think you have to make sure that every description builds into the story and the character in some way. So just off the top of my head, even things like clothing. So if you think of Cruella de Vil, the fact that if you describe her clothing, she is wearing a coat made of the dogs, that the whole thing is about how she's threatening them. So I think description is great, but it has to be relevant, and it has to either build character or build plot.
Excellent. And in terms of the characters, creating characters, because these characters will be the heart of the story. What's the secret of creating good characters?
I think it's voice. And I think if you look at books that have been incredibly successful, it's all about the strength of the voice. So if you think of Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, the kind of core value in that book is her voice, and she becomes alive in the first chapter, really. And I think the other thing I was going to say, if you're carrying on somebody's work, because I have actually done a bit of collaboration, you need to make sure that voice is consistent. So the characters are speaking in the same way, even if they're a third person character and they're observing things, it's still coming from the same kind of brain and the same voice.
I mean, picking that up, Rachel, I mean, in terms of that collaboration, that experience that you had, how did that work out for you?
It didn't get published.
So at least we're ahead of that.
Yes. But no, it was an enjoyable experience, but it is harder, I think. And there is a lot you have to do, and you have to kind of let your own ego go and make sure that you are carrying on what somebody else has started, because there's a temptation to build your own story unrelated to what's gone before, and it's important not to do that.
Right. And so, I mean, scenario with you, Brandy, I mean, in terms of Not Bad People, you've been praised for the depiction of the characters in that novel. How did you go about creating those characters?
I think one of the most important things with characters, and this ties in again to making sure that your book has got plenty of stakes, is to know what each character wants. Everyone has to want something, and there also has to be something stopping them from getting it. And it doesn't need to be something physical. Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't actually have to be like a wall or a virus. It can be something internal within themselves that's stopping themselves from getting it. But characters need to have desire and forward momentum. They need to be trying to do something, or else the book doesn't have any forward momentum.
Yeah. And from you, Annabelle, I mean, when you were creating your characters, were there things that you as you approach it, do you have a formula? Do you have a way of doing it? Do you have a dialogue with the characters? How do you go about creating them?
I think it's very easy, something that I do, which I shouldn't do. It's very easy to fall into the trap of having your good character, your hero, and making their life easy and giving them a nice house and a nice car and a good job and a nice family. Nobody is perfect. You have to make them imperfect. Everybody has imperfections. So your good guy has to face troubles. There's got to be something in his life that's actually not easy. And the same with the bad characters, the baddies. Give them something about themselves that's good. And this makes them more three-dimensional, which makes them more believable, I think.
Rachel,
Can I add something? While we were talking and everyone was talking about the needs and desires, I was thinking of, in Toy Story, and the fact that it links with what Annabelle was saying. So Woody's desire is to be Andy's favourite toy. And actually that is what is his kind of fatal flaw, if you think of it like a Greek tragedy. And so often it's, if you make what they desire the thing that leads to their fallible areas and to their kind of bad characteristics, then that's really interesting. And as the kind of story evolves, then you get onto what they actually need rather than what they want. So for him, what he needs is to kind of share and have a relationship with everybody, but he doesn't realise that at the beginning.
And is it more fun to write bad characters then?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so the converse of that is it's really difficult to write good characters, is it?
No, I think that you just have to make sure that they're not all perfect. And you have to make sure, I think, over the course of the story that they change, that they develop and evolve. Because if you get to the end of the book and nothing has changed in that character's internal landscape, then that's not a good story. It's not satisfying for your reader. They have to face some sort of change inside themselves.
Also, sorry. I was going to say, you can believe your character's good and actually your readers don't think so. The first protagonist in one of my books was the hero, and I based her quite a bit on myself. And then I've had kids say to me, oh, she was really annoying. And you're like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, how much of yourself is in any of the characters that you've written? Does it always feature, or does it never feature?
For me, quite a bit, even the unicorn.
Yeah.
Or it's somebody that you know closely. Perhaps I haven't got as good an imagination as the others, but there is always a connection to either myself or my husband or my kids or somebody that I know, so I can root it and it feels real to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a starting point, but you kind of explode it all with your imagination so that it doesn't end up looking or feeling anything like you. Like, I'm a lousy artist, and if I tried to draw a portrait of myself, it would be unrecognizable. And the writing is kind of like that, but in a really good way, because you don't want it to look like you. You just, the magic question that I constantly ask myself when I'm writing is, what could go wrong? Because you just want stuff to not work over and over, really, in a book, because if everything goes right, it's going to be a very short book.
Yeah.
And also not much fun. So, I mean, I got the entire plot of my book in which these Chinese lanterns catch on fire and may or may not cause a plane crash, because we were letting off Chinese lanterns a couple of years ago. And as they flew away, I actually thought, oh, I wonder what would happen if they hit something. You know, like, what could go wrong? And that's where the whole idea from the book came from. And even if you just look at your own life and think, what if that went horrendously wrong? Do you know what I mean? That's where ideas come from. It's kind of just extrapolating everything to extremes.
And in terms of plot, I mean, you mentioned this, Annabelle, that you're very plot driven. Do you spend a lot of time looking at plot then?
I tend to, in terms of getting ideas for plots, I tend to read the news a lot. And like Brandy said with her, what if this happened? You sometimes just a news story will spark an idea that you can start asking what if, and whole plots then appear to you. The news is a very good source for authors, definitely.
And in terms of the word that's often used is believability. That the story that you're telling, it has to be believable within its own context, obviously. What can you talk a little bit about that, or does it not, Brandy?
I have a rule for that, so I will. So I will, and I've also spent quite a lot of time with a bunch of legal academics in Australia for the plot of my new book, trying to create a legal case that would stand up, that it's the heart of this book. And the rule for writing is that something doesn't need to be probable, it just needs to be possible. So it needs to be possible that it could happen. Could these exploding lanterns have brought down a plane? Yeah, they absolutely could. Is it probable? Not hugely, but it doesn't matter. It just needs to, if it could happen, that is enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's what is the Mark Twain line, isn't it? That fact will always beat fiction, because fiction's always got to make sense, you know? So you know, we will always encounter things that we go, oh my, you know, that's crazy that that's actually happened. But that you as an author, you know, if you go to the reader, simply go, well, that couldn't have happened. But what you're saying, Brandy, is that as long as it could have happened, that's your defense. Yeah.
It is, but almost the opposite rule applies for your character actions, in that what they need to do has to be probable to the character. So you can't shoehorn a plot onto a character and make them do something that just really doesn't fit with who they are becoming as you write. So it has to be believable that the character would do it, if that makes any sense. But if you're building characters, they will start to sort of dictate what they would do anyway, and it kind of becomes quite obvious as you write, which is interesting.
Also, you can kind of call on other people's expertise. So in terms of believability, my first book had quite a lot of science in it that was obviously unrealistic, because these were kind of imaginary things like a brain ray that made people more intelligent, you know, daft things. But I wanted them not to be utterly unrealistic and to have some sort of science that people could go away and look up afterwards. So I started to look into, you know, which bits of the brain would be affected and how it would work. And obviously this isn't something that exists, but I contacted kind of real scientists and asked them. And so you end up with a plot that's not necessarily believable, but if somebody researches, they go, oh, actually, you know, there are elements of this which are true, which then build up to something that is completely fabricated.
I mean, have you ever had people come back to you? Sorry, Annabelle, yeah.
I was just going to say, alongside of the believability, what I find writing the type of story I write is you need to have relatability. The things that work best in the plot for me is if someone reading it could imagine that it could possibly happen to them. I mean, every time my plots go a bit wild, you know, I have to come back to that core thing. I want the person reading it to say, oh my God, what if that happened to me? You know, what if I discovered my husband had kept these secrets, or my daughter did this or that? And that's what makes a person want to keep turning the pages, I think.
And in terms of dialogue, I mean, some people find it easier, or some authors find it easier to write than others. What would be your advice on writing dialogue?
Listen to other people, I think. A lot of writers are probably not quite as chatty as the average person. I certainly listen more than I talk. And as I listen, I find I'm making notes on what people say, or I kind of collect really funny phrases, or just the way particular things are kind of communicated. And when I've written dialogue, I will always go back and read it out loud, because I think if you see it on a page, it doesn't work. You have to vocalize it. And my other tip, once you have a complete book, if that's the way they're doing it, is I always go back and I color code the different main characters' dialogue to make sure it's consistent throughout the book. And I find that helps me.
Excellent. From Brandy, Annabelle, anything on dialogue?
I read everything out loud. I'm constantly reading everything out loud. I pace around my living room. I think it counts as steps. Reading printouts to myself, because your brain hears something when you read it, and it's not actually just the dialogue, it's all of it. And so you can hear the rhythm of the sentences and everything else when you're reading stuff aloud, and you can catch the clunky stuff and the repetition and where you've got sort of 9 short sentences in a row, which, I mean, prose is like poetry in a way. You want a certain amount of variety, and you catch it when you're reading out loud.
Yeah, I think certain characters might have little catchphrases as well, and you have to just keep a tab of whose catchphrase, you know, which catchphrase belongs to which character. And then sometimes I do go back at the end of the manuscript and I will type into the search box key phrases just to make sure they haven't been said too many times, like do a search to see how many times they come up, and go back and change a few if it's too repetitive.
There are also kind of tech ways of hearing back what you've written. So if anybody has a Kindle, you can send it to your Kindle as a Word document and make it read you what you've written, which is a really good way to catch mistakes. And it's obviously a robotic voice, so it's not perfect, but it still works to an extent. And I'm sure I'm not very good at all the Apple things, but I'm sure there must be something the same on those that's probably better. I'm a bit old school.
I see you picking up on that one, Brandy.
Oh,
yeah.
Hearing someone else read my work, I think, would be yeah. That would be scary. I haven't opened the book or read it since it's been published. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It'd be like reading a review. That would be terrifying.
Oh, I heard my audiobook. I love it.
I asked to do my audiobook and they told me they wanted someone with experience.
It was very mannerly of them, wasn't it? So the guys have got, when they're writing this, and you as journalists, you'll be very, very familiar with this. They've got very tight deadlines. So they've got to absorb what the previous chapter is, and then they've got to get back almost within 24 hours. They've got to absorb that. They've got to write it, and then they've got to edit it. So in terms of the writing and the editing process, should they edit as they go? Should they just write it out as they go? What do you think would be the best way to do it?
How long is each chunk that these guys are going to be writing?
Mm-hmm. It's up to 1,000 words.
Then I'd say write it first and then edit. I think there's that whole thing about, isn't it, quantity leads to quality. So you just get it down first and you kind of think as you write and then go back and look at it. I think if you've got a bigger novel of 50,000 words, then I know some people that say they never edit, but I can't even comprehend how that's possible. I would always edit after, say, 5,000 words. But with 1,000, write, then edit would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I've written a scene just before we came on this call, actually, and it was 1,007. And absolutely what Rachel was saying, you get it down first. And in fact, the hardest thing to do is just to get it down without judging yourself. And because I tend to find that I can try and plot in my head, but what actually, where the plot comes out is actually when I'm typing. Like the typing is the creating of the plot. It's not the thinking. I find out what's going to happen as I'm writing it. I mean, I'll have 2 or 3 lines of things that need to happen, of points that need to be hit, and where I'm going to come in and where I'm going to come out. It's not completely structureless. But where I find out how it's going to fit together, and where the really cool stuff comes out, where links that you haven't necessarily thought of, or little bits that are going to be, you know, the stuff that's going to be important later, the hooky stuff, that all tends to be a bit more subconsciously. Like your brain does it without you realizing that it's doing it. That sounds a bit woo-woo, but it's not. I feel like all that the thinking you do kind of feeds into your subconscious, and then when it's typing time, it comes out. And so for me, the plotting and the coming up with stuff happens when I'm writing. So that first draft is where I kind of find out what it is that is actually happening. So I've got something to edit afterwards, and the two are quite different.
Annabelle, what about you? I mean, how do you tend to write?
Yeah, pretty much what Brandy said. I mean, I'll have a think beforehand and perhaps write down a couple of notes on where I want the scene to go. But once I start typing, that actually things will start happening that I wouldn't have even thought of if in my planning stage. So yeah, I would let that write fairly freely. And with a novel, having the time to go back the next day, I would go back and reread what I wrote the day before and just tweak it a little bit before I carry on. But these guys maybe don't have that much time to do that. So I would say have a think, make a couple of notes on the direction, maybe the beginning and the end of what you want to happen in that chapter, and then just start writing.
What about things such as punctuation, grammar? I mean, can they be full and free? Do they need to avoid exclamation marks? What are the things when you submit them to your editors? What drives them nuts?
Has to be pretty perfect, I would say.
Yeah.
I don't like any really strict avoid this rules, because I think there's always an exception. Yeah. But with exclamation marks, for example, just keep them, you minimize them, and definitely never use more than one at a time. Yeah. But then again, if you write kids' books, sometimes you can. So I think there are no hard and fast rules. And I think if you write that first draft, constantly hearing voices going, don't do this, don't do that, it will inhibit what you're doing. So I would get everything down and then go back to it and look through it. And for punctuation, it really helps to read aloud, like everybody's been saying, because you hear where the pauses are. You hear the full stops and the commas often. So yeah, I think, yes, there are things to be aware of, but write first and then judge it afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I've just finished Normal People about 2 years behind everybody else, and there's no speech marks in that, is there?
No.
It's just reported speech. I mean, I presume there's some kind of style continuity if everyone's writing a different chapter. They don't want people to go wildly off into experimentation and then someone else to come in standard. But yeah, I mean, that's something to think about in the editing, not when you're creating, because you just put brakes on yourself, really.
And what about the issue of writer's block? So there's, we've got somebody who's sitting there, they're, I don't know, maybe 10 chapters in, they've seen it, they're the 11th person to come in, and they're looking at it and they're going, oh no, what am I going to do? Are there any techniques, any things that they can do to get around that? Any help?
I would tend to do a spider diagram. I would write where the character is and draw a circle around it, and then I'd do all these legs of possibilities, things that could happen, and just let my imagination go wild. What could happen? And then I'll just look at them all and pick the best one. And that will help you write your way out a bit.
Sometimes it's possible to get that sort of blank page effect when you have to start a new chapter. And every so often, if that's really bothering me, I'll leap in and do a bit of a later scene and not try and kind of restrict myself to having to write a great opening. So if you're properly blocked, try and find, like if it was a road, you'd find a way around an obstacle. It's the same thing. Find another way in. rather than the obvious start at the beginning, if it's a real problem for people?
I lie to myself.
Yeah.
I tell myself that I only have to do 20 minutes. It's like, it doesn't matter how bad it is. It just literally, all you have to do is sit here for 20 minutes and do it. Because I tend to find with any kind of block that the problem is not the writing. The problem is the anticipation of the writing and
Right.
assuming that it's going to be hard and assuming that it's going to be terrible. Those two things, actually. And so I will avoid it and clean out every single cupboard and wash the dishes and, you know, do chores that have been hanging around for years. But if I lie to myself and I say, all you have to do is 20 minutes and it does not matter if it's rubbish, 20 minutes is generally long enough typing that I quite enjoy what I'm doing. And then I think, oh, but, you know, and then I kind of know what I'm going to put in the next paragraph and then you're off. So it's just the beginning of it. Like the hurdle tends to be just this fear before you actually begin. And once you've like jumped off the diving board and you're in, you're fine. It's
also, you could look at where your skills lie. So I tend to jump into, if I can't make a scene work, I'll jump into the conversation because I find it really easy to write dialogue. Whereas somebody else might jump into describing the room that this is all going to take place in. So I think don't kind of beat yourself up. Find the bit you like and jump into that bit first, perhaps.
Excellent. Now, Brandy, you prompted me. You said, is there a magic question to ask yourself to improve a plot, or if you are a bit stuck? So what is that?
Oh, I've already told you.
Have you? You've done it. We've covered it.
Yeah,
Excellent.
literally ask yourself what could go wrong. That is the
Okay.
secret to getting yourself. And it's much like Annabelle's spider diagram. It's just writing down what are 7 fantastic or unexpected things that could happen here. The other thing, weirdly, that I got told to do once, which is so odd but so useful, is to write down a list of everything that's in the room or the scene where you are, which just sounds so bizarre. Like literally you're writing down, you know, stapler, pencils, desks, whatever. But for some reason, thinking of the objects can make you think of things that could happen that involve those objects. And the weirdest ideas can come from that. If you think of what's actually in a character's room, you start thinking about the way they'd move and what they'd be picking up and what they'd be doing. And it's a really good endpoint, as odd as that sounds.
Excellent. So, I mean, thanks very much for your, you know, for your thoughts and all of this, guys. It's been really, really fantastic. What I'd like to do would be just to wrap up by you giving a final piece of advice, a final piece of encouragement for the guys who are just about to launch. We're launching on the 31st of May. So the first chapter will appear on both websites, on Which School Advisor and Schools Compared, on the 31st of May. And we're all getting very excited about that. So it's just to all of the guys here, we've got over 60 of them on the call at the moment, is just to say to them a little bit of work, you know, a bit of encouragement, a bit of help. And I'll start with you, Rachel.
First of all, I'd say enjoy it, because writing is fun. And I think sometimes you forget that when you've got deadlines. But enjoy what you're doing. And I think just ask yourself with everything you write, is this revealing anything about the character? Is this moving my plot forward? And if the answer is yes to either of those, then your writing is good, and keep going.
Excellent. Annabelle?
I would say if you're really stuck and you don't know what's happening, throw some trouble at your character. You know, make something go wrong, kill someone, or have some huge disaster happen, because that always shakes things up. And if you're the lucky person who gets to write the last chapter of this novel, make sure it's a satisfying ending for the readers. Make sure you deliver on the promise that was made at the beginning of the story so that it wraps up nicely. Otherwise, you're going to leave your readers going, what was that? And other than that, yeah, enjoy the process. It sounds like fun.
Excellent. And Brandy?
I talk it out loud, which, while I'm generally going for a walk, which probably makes me look like a bit of a nutter, but if I get stuck or whatever, I almost pretend that I'm talking to some kind of imaginary interviewer or something, maybe on stage at the Emirates Lit Fest, and I explain what the book's about and what's happening and what the character's about. And I find that if I'm talking about it conversationally, it can make stuff clearer or simpler to myself, because I can over necessarily complicate the thought process when I'm writing. And really what you're doing is you're telling someone a story. When you're writing a book, you're telling someone a story. So if you kind of speak that story out loud as though someone was saying to you, so James, what's your story about? Then you often cut through a lot of the waffle and you get right to the heart of it. And that can be really helpful.
Brilliant. Well, listen, guys, I mean, many thanks for your time and for the wonderful advice you've given to all of the writers here. We're about to embark on the journey next week. I hope you guys can follow it. And we'll be sending this, we've actually recorded this, so we'll be sending to the people who can't actually attend today. So I'm sure they found a lot of fabulous help from all three of you. And I'd just like to thank you once again for helping us out in this. It's really greatly appreciated. Many thanks again.
Thank you for having us.
It's
Take
a
care.
pleasure. Thank you.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.